Boris Worm is truly a great scientist, one of the most cited in his field of marine biology and biodiversity. He teaches at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's the author of some of the most influential and most frightening research on fisheries and oceans. In 2003, he co-authored a research paper showing that the populations of the world's large predatory fish, like tuna, cod, salmon, sharks, swordfish, and the like, had declined by 90% since the beginning of industrial fishing about 50 years ago. 3 years later, he and his wife, Heike Lotze, and others published a paper predicting the global collapse by 2048 of all the species currently commercially fished. That paper caused so much controversy that Worm has taken to calling it the crazy paper. Scary stuff. But Boris Worm is also a splendid public educator, a regular commentator for CBC Radio on ocean science and policy, a participant in such documentaries as Sharkwater and Racing Extinction. He's a strong supporter of such solutions as marine protected areas, large areas of the ocean left free of human interference and allowed to regenerate through the ocean's natural processes. Since 2013, Boris Worm has been the scientific director of Ocean School, a unique collaboration between Dalhousie's marine scientists and the National Film Board of Canada. If you need an injection of hope and wonder, go check out the videos on the Ocean School website, learn about the ocean, and listen to the young people who've learned to care about the huge domains of life that lie under the surface of the sea. I'm told that Farley Mowat was a great influence on you, and I'd like you to tell me a bit about that.
Well, he was, because I read Never Cry Wolf when I was in high school, and it left a huge impression on me for a variety of reasons. One is that you could go out there and research something and have an effect on society. You could live like that. You could be a biologist and be in the field, be with the animals, and then be useful to enlighten others with what you found. And that became almost like a motto for me pursuing the career as a biologist. And I was an avid hiker at the time, and I spent a lot of time in northern Sweden, and I observed animals much of the time. And my dream was to live like Farley Mowat and Never Cry Wolf, and make that a lifestyle.
But you went from there to being underwater, right?
Well, I always had a fascination with the water. In fact, my parents told me that the first word I learned to speak wasn't mama or papa or thank you or yes or no even, it was water. Because I loved to be bathed, and whenever I wanted to be put into bath, which was often, I would say ba, which was the short form for Wasser, which is German for water. And my parents figured this out, and they knew how to make me happy, and to a large extent, that's still the case. Put me in water and I'm happy. And I feel at home.
Which is pretty wonderful to have found a career that puts you there so often.
It does. There's a tension between time spent at the desk and working up findings and time actually spent in the water. And there's always a tension for me. But I live very close to the water. I see it every morning as I wake up, and I spend as much time in it as I possibly can. And it's always life affirming for me.
There must be a real tension between that life affirmation and that connection with water and what you've actually found out when you've gone out and done the research. And I wondered if we could talk first about some of the really frightening research that you've done, like the 90% paper, for example. Can we tell me about that?
Well, so you're right. I did not understand, I think nobody understood at the time, the extent of the environmental crisis in the oceans, and how much we had already deteriorated on a scale from healthy ecosystems to close to collapsed ecosystems. And it really happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that collectively we were waking up to this fact. And for me, it happened as I was, as a young ecologist, I was working here in Canada and back in Europe. I was spending a lot of time in the field. I was diving a lot. I was running experiments. I was in the water almost every day, so that made me happy. But at some point, I realized that I never saw a fish larger than about this. And I saw very few fishes to begin with. Most of them were tiny. And that puzzled me. And I did some research on those areas I was working in, and they did have large fish at one time, but not anymore. And then I began to wonder whether this was a more general phenomenon, whether this was particular to heavily exploited waters, say off Canada or in the Baltic or North Sea in Europe, or whether it was a global phenomenon. And Ransom Myers and I teamed up here at Dalhousie, and we did the research, and we found frighteningly that this pattern was a global pattern, even reaching out into very remote places in the ocean, that a lot of the large creatures, the large fishes, but also the large whales, the large turtles, the large sharks, even large seabirds, as of recently, have been depleted in many cases by an order of magnitude or more. And that left those ecosystems transformed and changed in ways that we don't completely understand, because we've missed a lot of this. It happened before we started recording these changes in any kind of concerted way.
So we don't have a baseline, basically. We don't know what it was in the first place.
It's called the shifting baseline syndrome, which means that every generation takes the world at their childhood as the baseline. So when you grew up, as I did, as most of us did, in a world that was already depauperate in many ways, we take that as the natural state, and anything that happens after that is seen as change, but not what happened before we were born. And there's a new branch of research that my wife actually got into called historical ecology, where people are trying to reconstruct in great detail what ecosystems actually looked like in the ocean and on land before humans started to interfere with them in a big way. And the surprising thing there is that you had to push back hundreds, in some cases thousands of years to reach that baseline.
And tell me a bit more about your wife's research, because that absolutely is, it's in a way, it's as though between the two of you, she looks backward and you look forward. And between the two of you, you have this huge span, but take us backward a little bit and tell us.
Well, Heike and I, we met in graduate school and back in Germany, and then we came over here. We both fell in love with Nova Scotia. It was really love on first sight, both for us individually, but also with living here and doing our research here and interacting with the community here, which we really appreciated. So we felt at home right away. And as you're pointing out, we had similar interests, but we diverged in somewhat different direction. I was looking a lot at global patterns of change, contemporary change, and also being interested in future change. And she very much looked backwards, trying to reconstruct how did we get here. So between the two of us, in what began as a very close collaboration, today we have somewhat separate labs here at Dalhousie, but we try to answer these fundamental questions of humanity. Where do we come from? Where are we here? Why are we here? And where are we going? And so that became a unifying theme with respect to the ocean. Haven't done as much research on land, but anything in the ocean has been of interest and continues to be of interest.
And her interests were not just in the ocean, they were also in the streams, right?
Yeah, the estuaries particularly, so where the rivers meet the sea, which are areas of high productivity, areas where people always like to settle. Think about the Hudson River estuary, which is New York, or the Fraser River estuary, which is Vancouver. A lot of great cities are in these estuaries, Amsterdam and the Rhine and so on. And so they have been places that have been transformed progressively and deeply over time by people settling there first and then spreading from there. But they're also very productive areas and hotspots of biological diversity and productivity, so she was interested in it for that reason.
And am I right that her findings were essentially that human beings would first clean out the large fish close to where they were, up the streams or wherever, and then would move down and out into the near shore and then clean out that, and basically like a systematic vacuuming of the oceanic world?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as a vacuuming because it was more selective than that. We, as a species, we evolved as a hunter of large game. So we would look for the big, obvious species first. Large marine mammals, but also the 3, 4, 5, 6 meter sturgeon that went up the rivers, the large runs of salmon that went up the rivers. A lot of anadromous fish were depleted first. Then marine mammals near shore and then further offshore with international whaling. Just because that's what we do. We go after large species first, and then we progressively work our way down the food chain to smaller species and then also further afield. And it wasn't until after World War II that we really reached global coverage, where We essentially closed the last holes in the ocean where species were still able to live in a quasi-pristine environment that was free of human influence. And that only happened with the advent of technology from World War II, which we published a piece in the New York Times a few years back called "When We Declared War on Fish." Basically, after the peace agreement after World War II, a lot of that technology was turned around and used to hunt more effectively in the ocean.
I want to quote Alana Mitchell's, I think summarizing this whole theme in your work. She says, "It took humans roughly 50,000 years to deplete the planet's large land animals, 5,000 years to exhaust most of the planet's coastal environments, 500 years to fish out the continental shelf, 50 years to impoverish the open ocean, and about 5 years to run through the creatures of the deep ocean." This is a terrifying summary of
It is. It's a little simplified, but by and large, this is the pattern. The reason for that is of course that as our technological capacities and our numbers of people grew, the time span that it takes to deplete any given resource shortens. The other reason for that is particularly as we went out into the open ocean and deep sea, these are low productivity environments. The deep sea specifically, it's like mining. Species there don't grow back on any meaningful time scale. Take decades, in some cases centuries, for them to recover from even a single fishing operation. So that's, we started with the really productive places at first that could yield some harvesting. With the technology at hand and the number of people, 50,000, 5,000, 500 years ago, there was still a lot of room to escape. And as I said before, these holes have kind of closed. And so now we rely on voluntary measures to limit our influence, to limit our technology and our advance in the oceans in a way that we can sustain these creatures and the ecosystems that, of course, in aggregate sustain us as well.
Tell me a little bit about creatures that would take hundreds of years or dozens of years to recover from a fishing operation. These would be deep sea fisheries.
Well, deep sea fishes, but I'm thinking about a Canadian species here. I call it the Canadian shark. Sometimes it's the Greenland shark. It's the only cold water shark that actually goes into the Arctic. It's now known to be the longest living vertebrate we have on the planet. It lives 400 years or more. It probably takes between 100 and 150 years to mature, so before it can reproduce. So if anything happens to this, think about this, Canada is just 150 years old. A lot of these species, a lot of these individuals were born the time Canada became a country, and they're only reaching maturity now. They're only able to reproduce now. So it's very clear that when we start killing these creatures, that it is like a mining operation. It doesn't really grow back on any meaningful time scale. And the Arctic is of particular concern here because it is one of the last refuges, not so much for whales and seals, which have been depleted before, but for fish most definitely. And the Greenland shark has never been a target in Canada, and it still isn't a target, but it's caught now in larger numbers in expanding fishing operations as bycatch, unwanted bycatch in the Arctic, particularly around Baffin Island. So that's a large concern for us, and it just repeats a story we've seen elsewhere. Of course, we first saw it, we didn't see it, but we can now reconstruct that this happened with the Pleistocene hunters who came into North America maybe 20,000 years ago, which drove or helped drive a lot of the large mammals that we had here, mastodons, giant ground sloth, camels, and others to extinction. And we're repeating this story in the ocean, but now we're conscious that we're doing it, and we have success stories, for example, with the whales, where we pulled ourselves back before it actually happened, before those species went extinct. And I will say I'm proud for humanity for having done that. It was one of the first collective actions of mankind, and we've pulled that off, and we can pull it off again with sharks and with seahorses and with fish and with corals and with all of these species that we so depend on.
Are we doing that?
Yes, we are. We are trying hard, in some places more than others. As anywhere in life, there's good players and there's not so good players. So one important exercise is to bring everybody on the same playing field. And to really have transparency in what everybody is doing. And what really makes me hopeful these days is not just that we have increasingly good regulation on fishing, for example, or habitat destruction in the ocean, but we also have ways of observing the global ocean that we didn't have even 5 years ago. For example, we can now see most fishing boats in the world from space and can analyze their movement on a very fine scale, meter by meter, almost second by second. So there's really no hiding out at sea anymore and going about illegal business without anyone knowing.
And that's very new.
That's very new. I have a student who helped develop that technology, and she's traveling around the world right now promoting this as a tool to, as I said, just improve transparency, because I think people haven't fully seen the fact that we've been fishing for 50,000 years, at least, and for all of that time, once you were over the horizon, anybody's guess what you were doing out there, right? Now we have radar and other things, but still a lot of fishing happens literally and figuratively under the radar. And that has changed now with the advent of satellite technology. So it's a game changer. And I think it will really improve our ability to see the ocean and to manage it much, much better, not with respect to fishing, but to other activities as well, because we can see everything.
Mm-hmm. But with fishing, that would be that's a spectacular difference, isn't it? I mean, I've seen a photograph somewhere along the line that showed the Chinese fishing fleet putting out to sea after a period of dormancy. I'm sure you've seen the same image, and it's breathtaking. There's like, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens
hundreds
of ships.
Hundreds of ships leaving at the same time. And when we look at the satellite data, we see that the Chinese fishing activity, globally speaking, is larger than that of the next 10 largest countries combined.
Really?
So it's a singular player. And again, I think for the longest time we haven't fully appreciated that fact. We haven't engaged with this Chinese in the way we should about these questions. And I think there needs to be new processes for really bringing all nations around the table, particularly the larger ones, and coming up with set standards. You were talking about a period of dormancy. It's actually not dormancy. It's that the Chinese have a fishing moratorium in the summer. It runs for about 2 months. It's the largest global signal we see in the seasonality of fishing effort, followed by things like Christmas and New Year's and Chinese New Year's and weekends even. We see that. We don't see a lot of biological signals when we look at global fishing from space. Pretty much fisheries now operate the same way factories do. You have a certain asset and it has to operate 24/7 to make money. And so it's not really tied into biological cycles very much. It's much like a factory operation. And I think it needs to be regulated like a factory operation.
That's a huge metaphor for human activity on the Earth generally, isn't it? That we have developed a system that needs to run 24/7, needs constantly to be fed.
Needs to expand over time in order to make money. So I think that's some of the problems we're dealing with, that model of mass producing goods and services, of course, has huge advantages, has lifted a lot of people out of crushing poverty and brought up the standard of living for most of us. But it also has come at a huge cost. And now I think we have to think about how to mitigate that cost. And to me, it's an exciting time, particularly for young people now, because in a long time we haven't had that opportunity to literally save the world. And now we can. We have the ways to do it. I have no doubt that we have the solutions we need. We just need people to run with it. And I think largely these will be young people who haven't been socialized to the same way in the culture of ever expanding and have maybe a more environmentally minded upbringing. And I see it in my classes, and I have great hopes that will change the way we first see the world and think about the world and then treat the world.
Well, in a sense, we're asking them to think globally in a way that nobody ever has before. I mean, when you just look at the fishing,
right,
and just look at the information that comes from the techniques you've just been describing. And the next question is, okay, now we can see what we're doing. Now we can see who is doing it absolutely piratically almost. And what do we do about that? So it really leads us now to say, well, how do we regulate globally? And that is a brand new thing.
And I just want to add that it's not just about regulation. We have a lot of good regulations, many of which are not followed very well, particularly out on the high seas, which belong to everybody. It's a common heritage of all mankind, but who are really policed by nobody in the way that individual countries, territories are policed and looked after. So that needs to change. So regulation is important, but I'm also thinking about incentives. So what I'm seeing is a large revolution in food production systems more generally, of which fisheries is a part, that buyers and consumers more and more ask for transparency and sustainability and human rights values to be upheld during the production cycle for these goods and services. And we had representatives here last year from the largest seafood buyer in North America, and they said that this is here to stay. They see this as not a fad, but something that just will keep growing, is the market for sustainable and environmentally ethical products, particularly in the food sector. And they said they first didn't think that it would stay that way, but they just say it's growing, and all the companies, the larger companies that they're dealing with, not just in seafood, but in food in general, they said 60% of them are losing market share because if you're not doing this, you're on your way out, essentially, which I thought was very interesting. So that's an incentive. It's not a regulation, it's an incentive that comes from changes in your and my and everybody's behavior, in the change of values, and even the change of values that these companies hold. Well, I will go as far as say any change we've seen in the world, has always come from an individual. It always started with individual. It didn't start with kind of an amorphous mass movement. It always was sparked by one person who said, this is enough and I'm going to change. And hopefully changing for yourself, walking the talk, and then inspiring others to change. And then it can be that viral effect where the culture changes. And I do see the culture changing from my childhood to now. There's a huge cultural shift. And I think that will be ongoing and probably accelerating.
And there's a huge opportunity then to be able to certify that this food product, in this case, but other things too, really is produced in a sustainable and ethical way.
Definitely. And it starts with transparency. So again, in this work with the satellite monitoring, we're not able just to see who's fishing where. We're also able to trace where that fish goes, because we can see where the boat offloads, either in a port or also very commonly to a cargo ship on the high seas, and then the cargo ship goes somewhere. So we can trace those transshipments events, which we never have been able to do before, and then see where it ends up. So I think we now have the tools to actually make sure, even for something that's as hard to trace as fish, probably the most globally traded commodity, food commodity, we increasingly have the tools to do this. And I think people who rely on unethical and environmentally damaging and illegal practices to go about their business, the margin for them becomes smaller and smaller.
And you could start at the back end, right? You could say, well, here is this unsustainably, or here is this fish that should never be caught, and it's available here in Winnipeg, right? But presumably you could now go back and say, okay, how did it get to Winnipeg? Yeah. Where was it landed? Where was it caught? Right back to the initial catching and to the crew of the ship that caught it.
That's right, yeah. You're bringing up the crew. There's a story there too, because all of this not just has an environmental dimension, also has a human dimension. Because a lot of that illegal fishing that happens or unsustainable fishing that happens also has a great human toll. It involves a lot of forced enslaved labor. And it's often linked with other illegal activities such as human or drugs trafficking. So once a fleet goes dark, so to speak, it goes dark in different ways, and it always has a human suffering dimension as well. So I think in bringing about a more sustainable fisheries industry, but food production and goods and service production industry more generally, we're also creating a juster and safer world for all of us.
Now this is fascinating also because you're a fisheries scientist, right? And one would say, well, okay, he's preoccupied with the activities of certain marine organisms in various places in the world, but your work takes you up to the point where you're really talking about human ecology, right? Yeah. And human values and the evolution of the human animal as an ethical species, right?
I will say I was dragged. I will say I was dragged into that reluctantly, because I am a biologist at heart, and as I told you initially, I just wanted to be in the water and be with the animals and be like Farley Mowat. But I came to realize that you cannot understand any aspect of ocean ecology by ignoring people, because we now affect every aspect, from the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the dynamics with climate change, with changed food webs due to fishing and other influences. Every single aspect of ocean ecosystems are affected, and in many cases, unfortunately, dominated by human activity. So that's a challenge. It's a great responsibility, because the ocean is the largest part of our life support system on this planet. But it's also, if you turn it onto its head, it's an opportunity, because when we have such a large influence, it also means we have large power to do good and large power to make things better, just by deciding to do so and inspiring others to do the same. And again, the poster child example for me there is how we save the whales. With we, I mean everybody on this planet, because up to World War II, we'd never really done much collectively as a species. We've never made a decision as humans, we're going to do that or not going to do that. It was always us versus them, and that nation or that faith or whatever other constellation, that tribe we had. Saving the whales we did collectively as people. And we started in 1946 with the International Whaling Commission. Took about 40 years to come up with the global moratorium on whaling. In human terms, it's not that long. It's 2 generations, not even.
And the history of whaling, it's nothing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Given the long history of whaling, it was a relatively quick change, and it was successful in saving the great whales, all of which were on their way out, literally. And we did that. And we're now enjoying whales here in Atlantic Canada. I see them off my house, but around the world in greater and greater number. Not for every single species. There's some that are, like the North Atlantic right whales, that are still very much threatened or even critically endangered in that realm. There's other species like river dolphins, one species of which has gone extinct in the last 10 years. In China? Yeah. Then there's the vaquita, the smallest cetacean, one that seems to be ever smiling, but there's maybe only 30 of them left in the Gulf of Mexico due to illegal fishing for another critically endangered species. So there's still a lot of problems. I don't want to paint a rosy picture here. We're struggling against a lot of momentum for decades and centuries and millennia of exploiting the ocean and taking it for granted. But then again, I also see that cultural shift, that shift in attitude, that shift in appreciation, and that shift in practices and tools we have to fix the problem.
It's a fascinating, David. One of one of the people I most admire, and that this series owes a lot to, is David Boyd. And David has written a book called The Optimistic Environmentalist, and he tells a number of these stories, and it's interesting to me. Like, another example would be the ozone layer and the Montreal Protocol.
Absolutely.
Which is something we did as a species, right?
We did as a species, you're right. Same for persistent organic pollutants like DDT and PCB. I mean, that was poisoning us as much as everybody and everything else. And we're now starting to do it for plastics, which is another global threat and problem, similar to persistent pollutants. It is a persistent pollutant. It doesn't go away, it just piles up in the environment and harms everything in its way. And we're waking up to that fact. A little late, but we do. And so I see a huge shift in attitude with respect to plastic and plastic in the environment, and I think we will see very decisive action on that in the next few years.
And that's happened very quickly.
That happened in less than 10 years. So the first paper I saw that got any attention about microplastics was in 2004, I think. By 2014, we were well aware of the problem, and it became a major research agenda. And then by 2016, 2017, we saw governments all over the world really making this a priority.
Yeah, wow. And people trying to figure out how to get the plastics out of the ocean.
That happens too. I think the main thrust should be to avoid getting more of it into the ocean, because we still, it's estimated between 5 and up to 12 million tons a year are put into the ocean. So that's a garbage truck every few seconds. That's the easy bit. Well, the easier bit is to just avoid more getting in, and it's very clear where a lot of it comes from, and there's solutions for that. In many cases, it's as simple as building proper waste capture systems like we have here in Canada. But we should remind ourselves, here in Canada, we threw most of our garbage in the ocean, at least in coastal communities, even as recent as 40 or 50 years ago. I live in a coastal community, and I dive a lot, and I found a credit card in the sediment, and the credit card was still legible from the 1950s. And I asked some of the older people in our community, do you know this person? They said, oh yeah, she lived right there. I found the credit card about 10 meters from a house in the ocean. The house was right on the ocean. And I said, why would a credit card end up in there? Did it blow off the balcony or something? They said, oh no, at that time, everything went in the ocean. Everything. We threw everything in the ocean. And I said, why? I said, because no garbage trucks came. We weren't part of the garbage capture system. So that was the only, it's either in the woods or in the ocean. And that's not very long ago.
Yeah, you remind me of something that Bill Reese said in one of our earlier interviews. And he said, you know, I cannot be sustainable alone. I can do my best and I can go some distance down that road, but I cannot be sustainable alone. If I want to take public transport, we have to have public transport. And I can't do that by myself. And it's the same with garbage, right?
That is true, yeah. There is a collective element here. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we are part of a larger society, and there's a certain way we do things, but the way we do things is flexible, it can be improved, it can be built on. And the fact that Nova Scotia now has the best recycling in North America is largely due, as far as I know, to the action of a few individuals in a single foundation, the Clean Foundation, who helped make this an issue in the 1990s, and it filtered through, and now Nova Scotia prides itself in having the largest waste diversion to recycling, I think, of any province or territory in Canada and maybe North America.
I think North America, because we have now had a tourism industry based on people coming to see how Nova Scotia handles solid waste.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that would be a tourist attraction, but
well, it is, you know, in a world that's desperate for solutions. I think it is like when people do something differently, it's noticed. And now that we can communicate so much more effectively and easily with each other, it's maybe noticed even more so.
It has some interesting side effects too. My wife and I sailed from Nova Scotia to the Bahamas, all down the coast through the Intercoastal Waterway. And coming from Nova Scotia, we were steadily appalled at how badly solid waste was handled in every single jurisdiction all the way down to Florida, right?
Right, yeah.
And people were surprised that we were surprised, and we didn't really set out to be ambassadors about solid waste, but we kept on seeing people saying, are you really still doing this? I mean, don't you have any mechanism for composting or recycling or anything like that? Yeah. And of course that has an effect. The people that we're talking to don't like to be regarded as being backward, but they are.
In that way.
And it has a real, a real impact. You know?
That's true, and I think generally sharing and living by example is much more powerful than we give it credit for. And people do respond. We're a social animal, right? We only survived on this planet because we are good in sharing information and making decisions collectively, often to the mutual benefit of the collective. That's our model of doing things. We're not individualistic, we're tribal. And so I think any change that happens, particularly when it's perceived as something that brings benefit to the collective, I think will be noticed and will be emulated.
Yeah. I think there's another implication to what we're talking about here too, of an intellectual, and when we kind of touched on this a moment ago, but I wanted to come back to it. Seems to me that the world you're describing is a world in which reductionism makes much less and less sense. It's served us very well in the past, but failing to see that you can't just study this little thing over here or that little thing over there, that it's all connected, and that what you do here has an impact over there. That's a big change intellectually.
It is. It's also very exciting to be part of it. So sometimes people say, what do you do? And I say, well, really what I do is I'm solving a giant jigsaw puzzle. The jigsaw puzzle is our global ocean, and every piece of research and every publication I read, every trip I take, every person I talk to who has anything to do with the ocean is a little piece in that puzzle. And it's a puzzle that has a lot of human layers to it, but then of course other layers as well, many of which we don't understand at all or very little. Particularly when you look into the deep sea, it's often said that the floor of the ocean, which is on average 3 kilometers deep, is less well mapped than the backside of the moon, and that's probably true. So there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of missing pieces in that puzzle. But you know, as a child, as you're putting a puzzle together, you kind of can guess at the overall image long before the puzzle is done. And I feel like individually, but also collectively, we're coming to that realization. We're starting to understand what the ocean is, why it's so important, why it's so fragile, and how what our relationship is. And I've become very acutely aware of a concept called ocean literacy, which simply means your awareness of what the ocean means for you and what you mean to the ocean. How does that relationship work, and how do I negotiate it, and how do I make decisions in that space? And most people, I think, are not quite aware that that relationship is even there outside of, say, spending time at the beach. But it's there with every breath we take. It's there with a lot of the food we eat. It's there when we enjoy a mild climate around here. It's there. It touches our lives in a very literal, down-to-earth way every single day. And to be aware of that, and to be aware how to behave in that space and with respect to that relationship, which has been a little bit of an abusive relationship, is a good first step. So we've built a program called Ocean School to bring about ocean literacy to kids in Canada, in the school system, but also around the world, and to really grow that, train that muscle, grow that sense of awareness of that we live on a blue planet, and what does that mean for us individually and collectively.
I think I'm quoting Boris Worm when I say every tear we shed ends up in the ocean.
That too, yeah. I mean, the amazing fact is that the composition of our tears, our blood, and our other fluids is the salt composition there is the salt composition of the ocean. We're essentially bags of ocean water walking around trying not to desiccate. That's what life on land does. But we came from the ocean. The ocean is our ancestral home. It's the cradle of evolution. It's where we are come from, and you can still see that in our tears, our blood, and we're 60% water. And I think we feel that we have a non-intellectual, kind of very gut sense of that when we spend time by the ocean, and we feel some connection. We know this is home. I really know it, because for me it's literally home.
Well, you live on Duncan Cove, right?
I live in Duncan's Cove, and but I mean, I even feel I can move more freely when I'm in the ocean. It really is a very special place for me personally.
I've been told that the smallest tides on the Earth are the ones that occur inside our skulls.
There's that.
And I guess there really is a tidal movement inside our heads.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. We're part of that. Again, as you say, it doesn't make sense to see us artificially separate from the ocean or reduced to a human existence. We're really a planetary existence.
Let's go back to the Ocean School, because this is tremendously exciting. And actually, one of the things that draws me to look at your work so carefully is the fact that you are operating kind of on the boundaries where education, research, and media all kind of intersect, right?
That's right.
And the Ocean School is a spectacular example of that. Tell me about that.
Well, I've done a lot of work with the media as part of my Folly Mode mission to bring more awareness, more interest, to bring stories into the world about the ocean. That's something I enjoy doing, and I feel there's a lot of hunger for. People like to learn about the ocean. They're interested. But I at some point I realized I'm not really reaching kids. I'm mostly reaching adults, and that's fine. But when we talk about sustainability, how can we sustain anything on this planet without reaching the next generation, reaching young people? And I spend a lot of time with kids in my personal life, and I always find they're just so aware already of what's going on. They have a very good sense of what's true and what's not true, and what's fake and what's real, and what's important and what's not important. And so I thought we need to tap into this and just give them more tools to learn about the ocean and explore for themselves. And that's how Ocean School came about. So it's a collaboration between Dalhousie University and the National Film Board of Canada. So we have the scientific expertise, we have the storytelling, media expertise, and then we teamed up with educators. I will say the Nova Scotia Department of Education, Early Childhood Development was the first to fund us, apart from Dalhousie and the NFB. They saw the value in this, in really bringing about a new way of learning as much as a new way of seeing the world through oceans. And so we produce this audiovisual content. It's all free for anyone in the world to use. It's available at oceanschool.ca. And you can spend days, weeks, maybe even months on there, exploring the content, asking your own questions, doing research. We call it inquiry-based learning, where you're not just kind of absorbing information like a sponge, you're more like a predator going out and finding the information that interests you and that you want to work with. So that's something we're really trying to promote right now. We went online only about half of a year ago, a lot of pilot testing up till then, and now it's up and running, and it's what I hear and what I see is kids and also teachers really like it, so I encourage everyone to have a look.
It's a fabulous resource. It takes you, I've had a long relationship with the ocean also, but this takes you right into the ocean in a way that nothing else I've ever seen really does.
It's experiential. Was really important to us, to not just make it arm's length, but actually to put you there. We use virtual reality and augmented reality quite a bit. But it's all real. So we film with 360 cameras where you're in the environment. You can look around either through a headset or with a tablet or your phone even. And one of the first things we did was the right whales in the Bay of Fundy, the endangered right whales. And I got an opportunity with a special permit from the Department of Fisheries to swim along with the right whales and film that experience underwater. We also saw basking sharks, the second largest fish in the world, very elusive creature in the Bay of Fundy, and we're able to film that. So you're able, through Ocean School, to relive that experience, which otherwise you could not ever do, at least not legally. Last year we went to Cocos Island off Costa Rica. We went in a deep sea submersible. That was the first time for me to do that. Less than 1% of 1% of 1% of all people will ever do this. It's very few people who are lucky to have that experience, and yet you're going down into the biggest place on the planet, the open waters and the deep sea, which cover, of course, more than 60% of our planet. And off the continental shelf, it's a totally different world with creatures every bit as fascinating as what we hope to find on Mars or Pluto or other planets. And to be able to live that, to be there, to see it, to explore for yourself, I think it is changing the conversation.
Tell me about some of those creatures. If I go down there, what do I see that I wouldn't see anywhere else?
So one thing, for example, that made me tear up with joy was a pelagic sea cucumber. So sea cucumbers are these kind of unwieldy, cucumber-shaped, pretty ugly kind of sausages that lie in the bottom and don't do much. They eat dirt, they eat sediment, and then it goes out the other end and they filter stuff out, and that's how they live. This was a pelagic one, meaning a sea cucumber that developed a lifestyle to live in open water. And it's kind of pinkish. It looks like a ballerina. It has like a veil with which it swims, and it's just like it's like a creatures from a fantasy novel. And I'm a biologist. I didn't even have it on my radar that this exists. I probably learned it somewhere back in undergrad, but I forgot. So when I saw this, it was like a fairy tale. It really was. It moves gracefully through the water. It's so un-sea cucumber-like, and yet, you know, who gets to see this? So yeah, that's an example.
What kind of depths and circumstances? Like, what kind of habitat would something like that have?
That was at about 250 meters, I think, and so quite reasonably deep, not extremely deep. But yeah, then I mean, of course, when you go deeper, very deep, few thousand meters, the last fish to be able to live under that incredibly intense pressure down there are called snailfish. And again, they look like a swimming whale with a head. And we only know about them from a few photographs and samples, some of them quite recent, where people have gone down and they're filmed down there. I think they're even in the BBC Blue Ocean series, the new one. And you know, you may say, well, that's interesting, kind of fun fact, but how does it affect our lives? Well, turns out that the snailfish, they have a special protein in their tissues that stabilizes their cells from breaking down. So the pressure is so intense that it starts to crush individual cells and deform the proteins in the cells, killing the individual. That's why so few species can make it down there. And they evolved a substance that stabilizes the proteins and the cells. And now it's being talked about to use that substance to help people with, say, neurodegenerative diseases, where you have that same kind of unraveling, unfolding of cells and proteins, and maybe that substance can help stop that process. So we're going down there on a journey of discovery and fascination, but oftentimes we're finding elements that can help us bring about a better world upstairs, so to speak.
Well, and also my understanding is that we are finding things down there that had been thought to be extinct.
Yes, yeah, living fossils. Yeah, there's a number of species that are considered living fossils, like the Kilosants, for example. Not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah, Latimeria is the species name. They're fish that were long thought to be extinct for hundreds of millions of years. And then they were discovered on fish markets, of all places. Yeah, so not even with a submersible, but fishermen in that process of fishing deeper and deeper pulled them up and sold them. And fortunately, a paleontologist went over that fish market, I think it was in Africa, and saw that, you know, something out of a fossil textbook there for sale. And since then, they also have been found in their natural habitat alive and well, fortunately. And I think their habitat is now also protected. But discovery continues. A friend of mine, actually in Indonesia, saw a similar species, different species, same genus, I believe, in Indonesia, very far away from Africa. Nobody knew they lived there as well, but they turned up on a fish market, and he described that first species from that sample. So a lot to discover.
Yeah, and now we've talked. This has been a surprisingly hopeful and positive conversation. You know, because I'm well aware of Boris Worm as having said, well, 90% of the large predatory fish in the oceans, 90% of those populations have gone, and that by 2048, if we don't do some correcting, we will see the collapse of all commercial fisheries in the ocean, because the fish just won't be there to sustain them. But this has been a very hopeful conversation.
You know, it is part done. It's partly hopeful because I published the papers you just cited in 2003 and 2006, and now we have 2019. And in the intervening, 15 years roughly, I've seen a lot of positive change, and I've been surprised how quickly we can change, and also the new tools I was mentioning that help us to turn the ocean into a more transparent environment where we can see what we're doing, and when we can see it, we can change it. I see more awareness for the ocean and its well-being, a lot more than ever before. And I see that it's really changing the conversation around the ocean. When I went to testify to the fisheries minister about solutions for the overfishing problem in 2009, I met with a lot of interest, but also a clear sense that in this country, oceans were, so to speak, at the bottom of the political totem pole. It wasn't something that would be high on the agenda anytime soon. And I think now, 10 years later, we're there. It's a very high-profile issue. People are very aware of what goes on, be it the whales or fisheries or oil spills or underwater noise or plastics is one of the most high-profile issues that touches all of our lives. And so that makes me hopeful. It really does. And I do see whales coming back. I see some fisheries being restored to former abundance. I see solutions being implemented left, right, and center. What worries me the most right now is that a lot of that is still very piecemeal. We're doing it here and there. There's no global action plan to save the ocean. Much like the Paris Accord is a global action plan to save the climate. It has its problems. It's not being followed very perfectly, but at least it's there. We don't have that for the ocean. So my hope is that we can come up with something. And the next decade, 2020 to 2030, is actually the United Nations Decade of the Ocean. I don't know when that last happened or whether it has ever happened. A whole decade dedicated to exploring, understanding, and being better stewards of the ocean. And so maybe that's the chance we get to make things right. I hope we do.
Yeah, to do a climate-like accord for the... Well, there was the International Law of the Sea Conference some years ago, and that was kind of like a baby step in this direction.
It was more than a baby step. It really was the first real framework, legal framework, to manage the ocean collectively. It was very, very important. But it was mainly negotiated during the 1970s when environmental awareness was just growing. And there's not a ton there on some of the environmental problems we're dealing with now. There's nothing there on plastics or climate change. And even fisheries, the sense there is still a lot more. We need to exploit fisheries in a way to feed as many people as we can. Less so, we have to make sure we're keeping enough fish in the water. And that's there too, but it could be improved. And in fact, there's a new negotiation underway this year at the United Nations to have a new treaty on biodiversity, so life in the ocean beyond national jurisdictions. Those high seas that are still oftentimes under the radar fall between the legal cracks, and to really have a much more concerted effort to protect species and ecosystems there, for example, through high seas marine protected areas, which of course are one of the main tools we're using now to safeguard ocean ecosystems.
Well, tell me more about marine protected areas and where we are with that, because that does sound like one of the major tools we have for this, right?
Most definitely, and I'm always, again, very hopeful when I see papers coming out all the time about the benefits of protected areas documented in various places around the world. And you have these big overarching analyses that looked at dozens or hundreds of protected areas and really show how they can benefit people and the environment alike. So that makes me very hopeful. It's one of the it's not the only tool. We have to do good management outside of protected areas. Right now, protected areas cover between, depending on what you count as a protected area, between 4 and 8% of ocean waters. So that still leaves 92 to 96% of the ocean unprotected by that tool. It doesn't mean it's completely unprotected. There's laws and regulations. But the wonderful thing about protected areas is they can really serve as havens for recovery for many, many different species, because we're not trying to manage each individual species by itself, but we're trying to preserve the whole, as we do on land. We have parks on land, we have special protected areas on land. We don't do industrial development everywhere on land. Nobody would think of that, right? We zone things. We have residential areas, industrial areas, agriculture areas, protected areas. we're now waking up to the fact we need to do the exact same thing in the ocean, and marine protected areas are a main strategy within that broader portfolio. And here in Canada, we're doing a good job finally, after many years of not doing very much, to increase our protected area coverage from 1 to 10% by 2020, and that's a very positive step in the right direction.
10% of what?
10% of our territorial waters. We have the longest coastline in the world. We have 3 oceans to take care of. We have an inland sea as a 4th ocean with the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway. So there's a lot there. 10% of that area is our commitment.
Out to the 200-mile limit or the 12-mile limit?
The 200-mile limit, yes, which is the waters that we have jurisdiction over. Yeah.
One of the oddities about this country, it seems to me, is that we do have the world's longest coastline. We do have a presence on 3 oceans, and most Canadians don't think of this as a marine nation because the bulk of our population lives far away from the sea.
Well, if you think about the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic Ocean as our only ocean, then it's true. Most Canadians live away from those coastlines. If you count the vast inland sea of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is, in my view, part of that same ecosystem because it exchanges with the ocean in a very dynamic way, then most Canadians are coastal people. I see this as more as a little accounting trick. It's we're all connected to our water, and whether that water is salty or fresh, it's still part of the same story, and it's the story of this country. It's the story of our well-being, and we just need to be aware of the fact that yes, there is a lot of salt water. There's a vast territory up in the Arctic that's turning to be ice-free pretty soon. And we'll have to be very, very careful about what we do there and not repeat the mistakes we've done elsewhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, once again, I mean, this is kind of like a theme through this whole conversation, is that you think of saltwater and freshwater as separate things, and what you've just said says essentially, no, they're not really.
No, they're part of the water cycle. So the water that grows our agricultural crops when it rains down on fields, that sustains our forests, our lakes, our rivers, our streams, most of that water comes from the ocean. It evaporated in the ocean, it travels inland, it rains down. And I see it as part of the ocean. The ocean is the largest part of the water cycle. It's the largest part of the carbon cycle. It's a large player in the nitrogen cycle. It really, our planet is run by the ocean and by its creatures. And that's just a very fundamental thing we need to understand, not just in this country, but everywhere.
I find myself always getting very concerned that we may have passed certain tipping points that we didn't even know we were passing. And with the oceans, there's a number of them. I mean, acidification, I wonder how far we are down a trail we don't want to be with that one. I think of things like the oceanic conveyor belt and the currents that determine climate for so much of the habitable world.
Yeah, you're quite right. There are these tipping points. We've seen them in the geological past. The ocean can turn anoxic, meaning lack of oxygen. It can turn toxic even, and we've seen a vast mass extinction in the past due to very rapid climate change that affected the ocean through natural causes, in this case, volcanism and so on. Those tipping points are there. I don't think we've crossed them yet. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that would suggest so. But we're also not quite able to say we're X years away from it. Right? It's something that looms large and something we need to avoid at all cost. And so the sooner we rein this in, the greater our chances to come out unharmed.
I quote Boris Worm once more, we don't realize how absolutely exceptional this time is. We're at the stage of losing the ability of things to come back on their own. That would be for me, that would be the big worry. Right? The biggest single worry.
Most definitely. I mean, with extinction, that's a major worry. There's a large number of ocean creatures now hanging on by a thread. The example that's in all of our mind right now is the North Atlantic right whale. Maybe 400, 450 individuals. They were on their path to recovery. Then the climate changed and their food source collapsed in the Bay of Fundy, Gulf of Maine, so they traveled on to Gulf St. Lawrence where they're less well protected. It's a very busy shipping area. It's a very highly fished area, so there's these new challenges. It's caused unprecedented mortality in the population. such that it started to decline again. Also, they're not giving birth very much anymore. So mortality is up, birth rates are down. It's a typical story for a species that just has very little room to maneuver, and even a few dead females, particularly because they sustain the population growth, can really be the make or break for that population. So definitely, when that last whale is gone, they're gone, and we're never going to see them back. And we've seen that in our region with the great auk, which is extinct, a large flightless seabird. We've seen it with the sea mink, our pendant to the sea otter on the west coast, extinct now. We know we can do this, but fortunately in the ocean, very, very few species have yet gone extinct, as far as we know. And most of them are still around. So there is a lot of hope. And you were saying this is more hopeful than you expected, and I will tell you what gives me hope, and I would encourage everyone to do the same, is to just spend time on the ocean. The amazing thing about the ocean is that every drop of it is filled with life. It's brimming with life. When you look under the microscope, you see dozens, in some cases hundreds of different life forms in a single drop. So we're never going to damage the ocean in that way that it's dead. We can greatly transform it, we certainly do. But the ocean has a lot of life in it, and it will continue to do so. And whenever you're out there, you see it, you feel it. And here off Nova Scotia, I mean, this is a very changed place. A lot of species like cod and the great whales have been depleted greatly. But also when you go out there now, not so much in the winter, but in the summer, and the herring are running, and you see these huge schools of fin whales and porpoises and sunfish and leatherback turtles and sharks and squid, and everything seems to happen there. It's like a zoo out there. And it's very life affirming, even right on our doorstep. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't see this, don't get to experience this. Again, this is something we're trying to change with Ocean School.
So a great deal of what we've talked about falls within the general realm of the expert. But if I'm, just a guy in Canada thinking about this whole issue, and I think to myself, what can I do about the oceans? What can I do?
Well, I think the first task is to learn about the ocean and understand a little bit your place in the ocean and how the ocean affects you and you affect the ocean. That's the ocean literacy piece. Then, for example, you can see that every bit of plastic you produce, a fraction of it will likely end in the ocean. Less so in Canada, but to some extent this is true in Canada as well. When I go for a walk, I pick up plastic from the beach every time. I look like a Christmas tree, with all the bottles hanging off me and so on. That's a simple thing that everyone can do. It's a simple way of giving back to the ocean in a small way. Something else is with respect to climate change, which is the major threat to the ocean, and ocean acidification. Every single pound of carbon dioxide we emit when we drive somewhere, or when we fly somewhere, or when we run our electricity, a large fraction of that ends up in the ocean, and it just dissolves in the ocean and acidifies the ocean. It's not like something we haven't figured out. We know exactly what that process works like, and it's personal. Every pound of carbon I emit, between 30 and 50% will end up in the ocean. So if I don't emit that carbon, it will not end up in the ocean and acidify the ocean. So that's a simple thing. Reduce the carbon footprint, help the ocean. It's a one-to-one, it's very simple that way. Another one is seafood choices. So we all, not all of us, but many of us like to consume seafood. I do. But I'm very conscious about the choices I make. There's wonderful resources like seachoice.ca or OceanWise program. They certify sustainable seafood. You're not just avoiding an impact there, you're actually providing incentives for the good players to keep doing things right. And you're taking market share away from those who are not doing things right. Simple thing to do, vote with your wallet. Then, while we're talking about voting, look at the platforms for different parties and see what they have to say about the ocean. I do this at every general election. I look into the party platforms and I search online for ocean, the word ocean in there, and I see what they have to say. I talk to my MP about it. You can raise your voice. We all have a voice in a democracy, and demand better ocean policies. So those are some of the very simple way you can do today. It needs very little effort, and it goes a long way to help the ocean.
I think that's a very beautiful note on which to end this conversation. I mean, the thought of a single drop of water, ocean water, being full of many, even hundreds of species, reminds us just of how miraculous this whole living world that we're in is.
And how alive, how deeply alive. And that's, we sometimes I will say I'm guilty of just looking at the data, and you can get depressed when you look at the evidence. But then when you're out there and you're experiencing it, you see it's very alive, and it's there's a lot there to be grateful for.
Because the Green Interview is based in Nova Scotia, surrounded by the ocean, we've talked to a lot of people with ocean-related concerns. In fact, I've published a book, The Living Beach, about ocean shorelines, how they work, and the people, the plants, and the animals that live there. So it's no surprise that we've also done a number of ocean-related green interviews with people such as fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly, Alexandra Morton, defender of Pacific salmon, Sarika Cullis Suzuki, who studies marine protected areas, and Alana Mitchell, the award-winning author of Seasick, The Global Ocean in Crisis. If you found this interview stimulating, you might also want to have a look at those. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.